When it comes to human anatomy, understanding bone structure is an essential part of breaking down the process of how various features and body parts fit together. And this is particularly true for the ribcage. Now, the ribcage has a very unique collection of bones, and understanding how to draw these bones and how they are placed together gives us a better understanding not only of this very unique bone structure, but ultimately how it kind of fits within the upper diaphragm and upper torso of the human body. With that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org, where we explore various art-related topics, and in today's tutorial, we will be learning how to draw the ribcage. Now, because the ribcage is very symmetrical, what we first want to do is we want to establish some guidelines that are going to assist us in creating a very symmetrical structure. Now, with that being said, you could use a grid to assist you in creating a very specifically placed set of bones, and then you can work through rows. But in this tutorial, we're going to work with a little bit more of a loose drawing process. Now, the intention here is to actually start working on each row of ribs one at a time, and what we're doing is we're basically going to kind of create this symmetrical row of ribs as we move from the top section of the ribs to the lower section of the ribs. Now, since we're starting at the top section of the ribs, it's a good idea to start with the jugular notch, which is this kind of bone indentation near the clavicles, or placed in the central area where the clavicles meet. This feature is also known as the clavicular notch, which will be attached to the first row of ribs. Now, what we do want to consider is how a reference image of this anatomical structure is representing these features. And this is where we really want to be paying attention to the very unique kind of formation and shaping of these unique features and how they connect to that first row of ribs. What we also want to know is, as we proceed with drawing and sketching in our ribs, we kind of want to understand that the ribs have these circular motions that kind of flow around towards the back of the body. So a rib cage is quite a circular feature, or quite a cylindrical feature. It does have this widening triangular generalized shape as a whole structure. But each of these rows, starting from the first one, will have this circular kind of structure as they shift towards the back of the body. The aim is to use the vertical line as a spacing tool. So the way in which we'll do it is, as we go through each row, we'll be constantly using the vertical line for guidance and then working on each row at a time. And what we're doing is we're carefully referring to our source image, taking our time working through each row of ribs. This is why we want to first establish these features with a pencil, and by doing so, we can then move on to adding in shading and so on. Now, as we move to the second row of ribs, we also want to try and mirror the shape of each row of ribs on either side of the vertical line. So you want to allow yourself to analyze the source image, then draw a set of ribs one side at a time. By doing so, you'll find that naturally, as the ribs start to curve towards the back, you can start to see them peer through the ribs that are placed within the front of the body. Now, naturally, because ribs are kind of encasing organs, what they're doing is they're wrapping around the entire upper torso. So what we are doing is we are basically drawing this curved structure. However, because we are seeing it from the foreground or from a front view, we get to see the surface area of the ribs from this foreground perspective, but then we can see the inside of that structure, or each row of ribs, as it curves towards the back of the body. Now, as we proceed, what we do want to consider is the thickness of these different rows of ribs. Now, each row of rib is different in thickness, and this is where using a reference image of an anatomical drawing of ribs, or an anatomical representation of ribs and a rib cage, is really important. This is something to consider as you proceed with the outline and you continue to draw the shape of each row of ribs. Naturally, as we work our way down the sternum, we'll find that the ribs start to get a little thicker and a little wider. Now, naturally, we want to try and maintain that kind of triangular shape, where as we move down our rows of ribs and we work on each row one at a time, making sure that they are symmetrically the same, we do want to make sure we keep that curved nature within each row of ribs. And naturally, as we draw them in, we'll see that as we go down the sternum, they'll get slightly longer, but then we'll also see that the curved quality kind of works in an upward direction. So as the ribs curve towards the back of the body, we want to make sure that they're always curving behind the previously drawn row of ribs, or the upper row of ribs, as we continue. Now, as we slowly work through this sketch, we'll start to find that when we draw in each row of ribs, it can be hard to kind of place them in this symmetrical nature. So what we can do is, with our light pencil sketch, we can also work with these horizontal lines where we basically establish the starting point and the curved point of each row of ribs. And this is also just another great way to kind of work loosely with a grid system in order to place your rows in a very symmetrical way and keeping them consistent within each row. And this way we don't have a lopsided section within our ribcage drawing. Now, as we continue, we can work with this trick of kind of drawing in these horizontal lines to establish the placement of our different rows of ribs. And especially as we get to the lower section, when we're dealing with the costal cartilage and those connection points that connect to the sternum and then create those distinctions between the bone structure and the costal cartilage, we really want to make sure that we are positioning them as accurately as possible. And we will spend time working with our pencil and eraser, probably going over it a few times, maybe erasing and correcting some of our pencil marks a few times, but that's okay. This early stage of sketching out the ribs should take time, and making sure that you use a reference image and referring back and forth to it is really essential for a more accurate representation of the rib cage. Now, as we come to the lower ribs, we want to make sure that we analyze those representations, those anatomical representations, and this is especially important for the false rib section. We'll start to find that the false rib section starts to have these very deep curved or low curving arcs within these bone structures or within these lower ribs and rows within our rib cage feature. And this is where we really want to make sure that we are kind of stemming them from the bottom section of our sternum and making sure that they flow in these downward diagonal directions and then slowly start to curve back upward. And as they do so, they will arc back towards the back section of the rib cage. And again, this is where we start to see that ribbon feature where the bone starts to actually twist in on itself as it moves and kind of circulates around towards the back feature of the rib cage. Now, make sure you just take your time working through each row one at a time, making sure that you are using your vertical line to assist you in this mirroring quality to capture that symmetrical feature between each row of ribs. And that's where basically we simply want to work our way down, and as we do so, we start to focus on each row of ribs or each feature within our rib cage and kind of use one side as a reference point for the other side as we continue to draw in our various rows of ribs. Now, we want to continue this process, especially focusing on that lower section, those false ribs. And this is where we start to see the ribs between 6 and 12, where basically the ribs start to get a little bit smaller. The structure starts to be quite unique in terms of shape. And this is especially true for the costal cartilage, and how there is this distinction between the costal cartilage as it connects to the sternum, and then as the bone structure connects to that costal cartilage and flows around towards the back of the body. So again, thinking about these features as we draw them one at a time is really important in terms of spending time on them, making sure that they are in scale and proportional to the rest of the features within our rib cage, and making sure that we are representing them as accurately as possible in terms of making sure the costal cartilage is creating this distinction between the ribs, making sure the length between the bone structure and the costal cartilage in each row of rib is as accurately drawn as possible. And again, it's okay to spend time on this early stage of sketching and erasing, making sure we capture the shape, making sure that we are keeping our drawing quite light at this point, so it's easy to fix any mistakes. The aim, again, during this early stage is to capture the general form, structure, and placement of these various features within our rib cage. Now, as we start working with these lower ribs, again, another important thing to pay attention to is how the ribs curve around towards the back of the rib cage. And these moments can be seen through the rib cage, so making them visible between some of the high ribs is going to be a part of this drawing process that we really want to take our time with. In terms of representing the rib cage in a very realistic way, we do want to make sure that we are representing the curvature or the curved nature of each shaft of the rib as it curves towards the back of the rib cage through the upper rows of ribs. So making sure that we take our time working on each feature one at a time, making sure that we do one side first and then using that as a reference for the other side, and then kind of emulating the same drawing process in this mirrored image is really essential for a more accurate drawing of a rib cage. So it is really important for you to take your time with this pencil sketch process, and especially with the curved aspects of the ribcage. Remember, you do want to think about this curved nature of the shaft of each rib or row of rib as a ribbon feature. And when you think about a ribbon, again, naturally, as a ribbon kind of curves in on itself, you can see that the surface area curves as well. And then what we see is the outside of the surface area. But then as we come to the back of the ribcage, we can see the back side of that surface area through the front foreground, or through the front row of ribs that are placed in the foreground. So thinking through that concept, taking your time, looking at an anatomical reference and proceeding with that early sketching stage is really essential before we start moving on to lightly shading the ribcage. Now, lastly, we want to capture this bottom section of the vertebrae, as well as they are going to be present from the bottom section of the ribcage, or kind of coming behind the bottom section of the sternum. Naturally, because the ribs are connected to two main structures, for one being the sternum that is placed in the front of the ribcage, and then the spine that is placed in the back of the ribcage, representing that lower section of the vertebrae between T11, T12, and T13. Those lower vertebrae features kind of contextualizes the ribcage and kind of demonstrates how those rows slowly move towards the back and give some sort of reasoning to how they connect to the back of this ribcage structure, or the skeletal structure as a whole. Now, once we have basically established this light sketch, we've worked our way from the top rows of ribs, we've established all the surrounding features, including the sternum and other contextualizing features such as the lower vertebrae and the floating ribs that connect to the lower vertebrae or spine. We can then start moving on to adding in some light shading, and this is where we use our pencils, or a darker pencil now, to give a little bit more detail, contrast, and depth to our ribcage structure. Now, naturally, in order to create depth between the foreground and the background, we're going to start shading in the ribs that are seen through the front section of the ribcage and are present within the back side of the ribcage. Now, shading in the ribs as they curve towards the back side of the ribcage, we will find that naturally it's going to establish this quality of shadowing, and more specifically shadowing on the surface area that is present inside the ribcage. Now, naturally, what this will do is it will create this quality of highlights and shadows, and what this inevitably does is create a more three-dimensional nature within the ribcage, and ultimately results in a more realistic representation of how shadows would be visible within the structure. Now, we do want to think about how the bone structure is as a whole, and this is where we think about which areas of the ribcage would naturally be more exposed to a light source, and that would obviously be the front section, or the rows as they come towards the foreground. Those areas and those features will be more exposed to a light source, and therefore they should be slightly lighter in tonal value. Now, once we have basically filled in or shaded in the back section of each row of ribs, we want to start thinking about the structure of the ribs that are present within the foreground, and this is where we start to be a little light and a little more intentional with our shading in terms of representing the subtle curves and indentations within the bone and cartilaginous structures of each row of ribs. So what we do want to start thinking about is how the cartilaginous structures have these little indentations, or these little grooves that run through them, and also the distinction and the connection point between the cartilaginous structures and the bone structures within each row of ribs. So what we want to do is want to work our way again from top to bottom, and this is where we slowly start to also integrate some shading marks into the sternum. In doing so, we can start to define the actual three-dimensional nature of that bone structure, and ultimately give it some more form and allow it to not necessarily look two-dimensional and therefore fall flat. So we do want to think about how these bone structures and these small features also require some light shading in terms of representing their three-dimensional nature, in order to give our drawing a little bit more of a realistic quality. As we proceed with the shading process, something important to think about are smaller details, and this is especially true near the lower section of the ribs. Near the 7th and 8th rib, there are these little cavities, and these cavities require some shading around them in order to kind of represent their three-dimensional nature. So what we do want to do again is make sure that we are looking at an accurate anatomical reference as we proceed with our rib drawing, in terms of assisting us and helping us understand how these various features are represented within the rib cage. And this is especially true for the shading process. We do want to make sure we are giving dimension and form by integrating some shadow formation to the three-dimensional structures that are present not only in the background but in the foreground as well. We also want to think about tonal variation. So again, in order to establish that quality of depth and kind of pull the foreground away from the background, we can make the rows of ribs that curve towards the back slightly darker as seen through the front section of the rib cage, and then the front section of the rib cage can be slightly lighter in tonal value in order to create that quality of depth and an accurate representation of shadowing within the rib cage structure. Now, as we proceed with this process and slowly start to build up our shadows with some darker pencil marks and working our way into the contextualizing surrounding features, especially the vertebrae and the floating ribs that are represented in the back, it's important for us to then start thinking about darkening and adding more contrast. And this is where we're going to start shifting towards integrating some ballpoint pen or some pen shading into our drawing. Now, the reason why ballpoint pen is a good suggestion is because the medium functions very similar to that of a pencil shading process, and that is because there is a lot of autonomy and agency with the shading process of a ballpoint pen, and this is because the ink comes out quite sparingly, which allows us to have a lot of control over our mark making process and therefore be a little bit more cautious with our shading. Now, the intention with our pen shading process again is to start from the top of the rib cage and slowly work our way down, and this is where we're actually going to basically use the pencil marks to assist us and guide us in our pen shading process. Now, we should have basically a fully drawn rib cage at this point done in pencil, but from here on out we are simply going to proceed to use a pen to integrate some darker contrasted marks and ultimately emphasize the shadow formation and highlighted qualities within our rib cage. Now, as we move from the top of the rib cage, slowly working our way down to the bottom of the rib cage, we want to make sure that we attend to each row of rib one by one. Again, slowly working on one side and then using that as a reference for the other side. We also want to make sure that we are darkening each rib as they move towards the back of the rib cage. Keeping the ribs that are visible at the back of the rib cage slightly darker is again going to demonstrate this quality of shadow formation and therefore establish this quality of depth within our rib cage structure. Now, a particular feature to make sure we focus on is the way the bones curve. Now, we want to notice the areas of curvature as there is a moment where the bone moves from light to darker tones. And this is especially true from shifting or as they shift from the foreground into the background. We want to make sure that we are emphasizing that shift with some shadow formation that gets slightly darker, and we can do so with some pen shading. Again, treat your pen as a pencil, and this is where you pay attention to pressure, this tool that has an effect on tonal value. So thinking about those moments of curvature and kind of creating these seamless gradients that shift from light to dark is really essential, and this is why we want to slowly work our way through the rib structure, focusing on one row, one at a time, and how it curves towards the back of the body. This also just minimizes the complication of the drawing process and keeps you not confused and kind of wondering which rib structure kind of goes where. So making sure you focus on each row one at a time is really important. Now, as we continue with the shading process, it's important for us to really make sure we are distinctly representing a difference between costal cartilage and bone. We can see that the source image or a reference of any anatomical ribcage structure represents the rows very specifically in that the costal cartilage connected to the sternum is different in color to that of the bone shaft within each row of rib. Now, spend your time slowly adding in your pen shading, making sure you're going over your pencil marks as a guiding source, making sure you refer to the reference image, and slowly work your way down all the way to the lower section of ribs. The lower ribs are the most intricate part of the rib cage, so allow yourself to take it slowly. If you do feel tired, make sure you also take a break. You kind of want to come back to the process feeling refreshed, and that way you're less likely to make a mistake. Some things to note is that the 9th and 10th ribs are slightly darker as depicted in most anatomical rib cage representations. So we want to make sure we notice all the little details within each row of ribs as we draw. And this is especially true as we come towards the false ribs or the lower ribs between 7 and 10. or row 7 and 10, where we start to see how they connect to the lower section of the sternum and have these kind of cavities near the sternum, and how to kind of give them three-dimensionality by shading around them. We also want to kind of attend to the sternum itself, and this is where we start to work in some lighter moments of shadow to give these qualities of indentation and kind of textural qualities to the sternum. Therefore, it just doesn't fall flat, and ultimately gives it an actual three-dimensional feature. We can also begin to add in some shading to the bottom thoracic vertebrae as depicted within an anatomical reference image of a rib cage. We do want to make sure that we spend some time shading in the contextualizing features like the vertebrae in order to keep a consistency within our drawing of our rib cage structure. We should be finalizing our ribs drawing by now, adding these last moments of shading near the bottom of the spine, making sure the spine is attended to, making sure that each row of ribs has these distinct moments of shadowing, making sure the back features of the rib cage are slightly darker in tonal value, and then the features that are present in the foreground are slightly lighter. Also making sure that there is a distinction between the costal cartilaginous features and how they kind of are distinctly different to that of the bone structure within the shaft of ribs. Again, making sure you take your time working from the top all the way to the bottom, slowly attending to each row of rib one at a time, making sure you work on one side and then use that as a representation or a reference image for the other side, in order to establish and create a consistency within your shadow formation within each row of ribs. Otherwise, guys, that is it from me today. This is the general process of how to draw a rib cage. Some key things here to think about is, number one, shaping the ribs, really trying to capture the symmetrical quality of the ribs. So that means the early stage of sketching the ribs lightly is really essential, and that's where you want to get that circular, triangular kind of shape in terms of how the ribs get slightly wider near the bottom. Thinking about the rows of ribs and how they connect to the sternum and these various features, including the costal cartilaginous features, as well as the false ribs and the contextualizing features such as the vertebrae beneath the sternum, and then how to integrate shading to represent the three-dimensional nature of these bone structures and cartilaginous structures. And this is where we can shade in the back section of the ribs slightly darker, and then work in some lighter shading in the foreground to create that quality of three-dimensionality. But otherwise, guys, that is it. Understanding a complex structure like a rib cage and how to represent it in a drawing is not so difficult once you look at a reference image, break it up into a simple sketch, and then build up your layers of shadows through a shading process is all it is. It's simply a matter of patience at the end of the day. If you did like this video, please let us know by liking and subscribing. This ultimately grows the channel, which then inevitably enables us to make more art related content for you guys. If you are interested in other related topics similar to anatomy, please let us know in the comment section below. We would love to do more anatomical related topics. But otherwise, guys, thanks again. That's it from me today. Until next time, cheers.